I want to welcome everyone to Greenville Technical College's 2024 Constitution Day event presented by the School of Arts and Sciences Speaker Series. My name is Jamie Roughton. I am the Associate Professor of Political Science at Greenville Technical College. Today, we are happy to have with us Dr. Schattle. Dr. Hans Schattle is a professor of political science at Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea. So he's joining us from afar today in a very different time zone. So he works across the usual dividing lines in political science and international relations, with interests ranging from citizenship, democracy and globalization, to the politics of Europe, East Asia, and the United States. Professor Schattle has written 2 books, Globalization and Citizenship, and The Practices of Global Citizenship, both published by Rowman and Littlefield, as well as numerous articles in academic journals. He earned his doctorate in politics at Oxford, and most recently, he has co-edited the volume Making Social Democrats, Citizens, Mindsets, Realities, published by Manchester University Press. Professor Schattle presents research papers regularly at leading international academic conferences and often gives interviews to journalists around the world. He worked as a news reporter in his native New England before launching his academic career. Professor Schattle, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today, and we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Hi there, Professor Roughton. Thank you so much for taking the time to organize this special event, and of course for inviting me here to speak with your students and I think the larger campus community at Greenville Tech. It's a pleasure and an honor to engage with you all and have this time together. I realize we're celebrating Constitution Day one day early, and that's partly on account of my travel schedule as well. So thank you for your flexibility with that. Good to see you all here, and I look forward to your questions after the talk. As I was thinking about how to communicate my thoughts with you today, I came up with a list. I realized that there was basically a small number of basic but hopefully interesting points that I wanted to make about the US Constitution as we observe this Constitution Day. And today also happens to be Citizenship Day as well. And I've written a fair amount about that over the years, as Professor Roughton mentioned. So I'll have a few words intertwined about citizenship as we work our way through. So I'm going to share screens now because I ended up making a list. It is sort of a top 10 list when it comes to some thoughts and observations about the US Constitution. So I'm just pulling that up now at my end. And as soon as I get that up, I'll let you view it along with me. We can work through this together. I expect to talk for about a half hour or so, and then we can take some questions and answers right after that. I know, as Professor Roughton said, some of you have submitted questions, and you're more than welcome to jot down any questions that occur to you as I'm speaking, particularly if I say something that you don't quite understand, or if I say something that you disagree with. If you disagree with what I'm saying, especially, please make your voice heard, and I'll try to interact with that and engage with that. When it comes to a topic such as the Constitution, there's inevitably many different interpretations and even a lot of contestation involving the document itself and what it means and how we might look at it. So here's my top 10, so to speak, my 10 points about the US Constitution. So number one, and this is just some basic historical background, particularly for those of you who might not have studied US history or American politics as yet. But it's important to keep in mind when we're looking back at the Constitution. And it is an ancient document in some respects when it comes to our political thinking. It's going to celebrate its 250-year anniversary, which in some respects may not be that old. In many respects, the US is still a fairly young country, I suppose. But in terms of a country that has kept its political system intact for a quarter of 1,000 years, quarter of a millennium, that is remarkable. So sometimes I think now we take, many of us anyway, may take the Constitution for granted. It's useful to remember that when the Constitution was drafted, it came into existence at a time when people, not just the constitutional framers or the founding fathers, as we call them, but everyday people, people on the street, the bakers or butchers or tailors or blacksmiths or postmen and so forth, all the everyday people didn't really think of themselves yet as Americans. At this point in time, people identified mainly with their states or even with their cities and towns. It wasn't really, if you go forward in history, it wasn't really until after the Civil War when the idea of thinking of the country as entirely unified really came to mind. I mean, people didn't talk about the US of A or USA even at the time of the Civil War. If you read the history throughout the 1800s, right up to the Civil War, people called the US the Union at that time, almost in the same way that Europeans now think of the European Union as something beyond the state. Americans at that point, or more accurately, South Carolinians or Rhode Islanders. I'm from Rhode Island, by the way, or Bay Staters in Massachusetts, Bostonians, New Yorkers. People thought about themselves primarily in local terms and not as Americans. And what's more, nobody knew, honestly, if the new country was going to last long. One of the reasons that the Constitutional Convention took place as it did in Philadelphia in 1787 was because there was a lot of anxiety that under the previous system of government, and in some ways it was so loose we wouldn't even necessarily think of it as a system, it was a confederation, which meant that power was not really distributed in a way that gave the upper level of the system a great deal of authority and power. Power was distributed in the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s, much more in the direction of the states, which meant that this new country, which had only come into existence a few years earlier when the British were basically evicted from the 13 colonies making up the eastern seaboard of North America, this was a brand new country. It was barely holding itself together. And by the late 1780s, again approaching 1787, the economy wasn't good. Soldiers who had served in the Revolutionary War were angry because they hadn't been paid for their work years earlier. Many of these same people who owned farms or other little businesses or houses were in danger of losing them to banks because they couldn't pay the bills. On top of that, geopolitically in Europe, this was the heyday of European imperialism. The British, the French, the Spanish, even the Portuguese and the Prussians to a degree were all bent on conquering the world. Even the Belgians and the Dutch, you might think of them as small countries now, but they were powerful back then. And all of them were also still eyeing North America. It wasn't entirely clear that the British were really done and over with the 13 colonies. Or did the French want to get back in? The Spanish, did they want to expand the land that they had? The Spanish still controlled Latin America. They even controlled parts of Florida. They were in the process of losing control over what became Florida, but they controlled Florida. They controlled much of what's now the American Southwest. It was not a given that this country was going to hold itself together. And under the Articles of Confederation, it was almost a certainty it wasn't going to hold itself together. So one of the reasons that the Constitution was written in the first place was simply to try and hold the country together, to put together a system at the top that would have enough coherence and strength to it, while at the same time giving the states the ability to retain quite a bit of powers unto themselves. That's what we mean by federalism. When we talk about federalism, we're not just talking about the federal government. Today we use that term kind of synonymously with the national government. But federalism in study of politics is really any system that distributes power and disperses power, both, as I'll say in a moment, both horizontally and vertically. So that was the key to try to come up with the right kinds of compromises to make the Constitution work. So that's the first point, that this was a precarious time. And the framers had to come up with almost like a magic, intricate formula to try to figure out how to basically create a more coherent government at the top without the public feeling as if what they had fought for in 1776 and beyond had been stolen from them. Because as we go on to point number 2 now about the Constitution, that is exactly how many everyday people felt when the Constitution was released in its draft form, its advanced draft form in 1787. Many critics, and by the way, some of the most vociferous critics of the Constitution after it was drafted were the very people that fought the hardest in 1776 for liberty and for revolution. Many of the most well-known patriots, people that we still look back upon as the leading patriots of the revolutionary cause, some of these folks were furious when the Constitution was drafted. Among them would be Samuel Adams. Again, I'm a New Englander, so if any of you know Samuel Adams beer, that's named for that great patriot. He was, of course, related also to John Adams. Another one was Patrick Henry. The famous saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," comes from Patrick Henry. He too was opposed to the Constitution. And the main reason that people opposed it, and this is also really there's nothing about political parties formally written into the Constitution, but it's the debate over the Constitution that actually sets the tone for what became eventually partisanship in the US after the first decade of its history with the Constitution. So the Federalists, the people that supported the Federation that was going to have this stronger national government, those are the folks like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, who wrote many of the essays defending the logic of the Constitution. I'm sure some of you read them in your classes. But then there were anti-federalists. There was a whole wing of people also furiously writing essays arguing against the Constitution. And two of the main arguments that they had, one was that many saw the Constitution as potentially overturning the key principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration, aside from its main point, the part that we all know about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal and all are endowed through their creator with natural and inalienable rights, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That if government doesn't serve the interest of the people, if government doesn't really have the legitimate consent of the governed, then the people have the right to overturn it. That logic, that popular consent was the ticket to legitimate government. And that centralized government, again, their declaration was not just about those key points. It was about the colonies declaring a divorce from the parliamentary system with the monarch in Great Britain, which was an extremely centralized form of power. No taxation without representation was an outcry against overly centralized government. That's why the Articles of Confederation that I just mentioned had such a decentralized system in which the national government was minimal. It was basically just a small Congress and a post office and a few other agencies and not much else. Had no power to raise revenue even. So now basically for the colonies and then the states, the pendulum went in 1776 from centralized power to very decentralized power after that with the Articles of Confederation. Basically, with the Constitution, the framers were swinging the pendulum back again towards something more centralized, but hopefully in their minds, not something nearly as centralized as the British system. So that was one point of opposition, was that this was by basically de-emphasizing state and local control, that the principles of the Declaration were in great danger, maybe even being in the process of being overthrown, and that they were being overthrown by a group of wealthy merchants and even in some cases landowners, that the people who controlled the money, the people who had the most financially to gain by a stronger central government, and perhaps the people with the most to lose if things went wrong in the US, that these were the people banding together. Now definitely the constitutional framers were wealthy. I guess we could dispute what the anti-federalists were saying by arguing perhaps that it wasn't just their own wealth that these people were looking after. They were looking after a larger public good that was about holding the spirit of 1770s, holding this new country together for the long haul, for the long term, in the face of some very difficult problems and obstacles that it was encountering in the late 1780s. So that's point number two. Point number three is connected to this, because remember that the first draft of the Constitution, or the Constitution as it was presented to the states for ratification, it did not have the Bill of Rights in it as yet, which for many of us, I think today, many of you might not necessarily know all the little intricate details of the US Constitution, the articles, the main parts of the Constitution that actually assign powers to specific branches of the government. You probably know some broad sketches of that, but I'll bet what you all know very well if you've studied American politics would be the Bill of Rights. Most people, by the way, when they think about the American founding, they associate the key documents mainly with the Declaration. In fact, there was a famous gaffe about 10 years ago. Then House Speaker John Boehner announced in a speech one time that he was reading this excerpt from the Constitution. He was actually reading an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence. Many people kind of confuse the two of them. Today we think of the Declaration as very important. The Constitution's articles, of course, are indispensable because they set up the system of limited national government that we have. It's the Bill of Rights. It's the first 10 amendments that actually provide protections to the public against arbitrary interference of government power. So when we think of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom to petition the government, freedom of religion, uh, Amendment 2, the right to bear arms, a contentious amendment, one that still remains in place today. The question is how to go about interpreting that. The protections in the Fourth Amendment against search and seizure, amendments, an amendment, by the way, that in some ways is in difficulty these days with the ubiquity of online surveillance, but still, nevertheless, still written in there. The Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Amendments, which are all about how citizens must be treated fairly by the legal system, especially if they're the target of either civil lawsuits or criminal complaints. So, again, the first 10 amendments were really important because they sent a message once they were added in that the Constitution would not overturn the Declaration of Independence. It didn't necessarily win over the hearts and minds of the naysayers, but those who were skeptical, and by the way, Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, he was actually quite skeptical of the Constitution when it was first drafted without the Bill of Rights. And he was writing letters from Paris. He was an American emissary in France at this point in time. He missed the heart of the constitutional debates, as some of you, if you've watched the play Hamilton, you'll know. Jefferson makes his grand entrance back in one of the later acts of the play, and his song at that point is "What Did I Miss?" And he was away, but he was writing back and forth. He actually argued for a Bill of Rights to be added in, and James Madison actually had a different view. Madison thought that it'd be superfluous to put in the Bill of Rights, that you could assume that these rights would be upheld because the Constitution was all about limited government. Um, but on the other hand, the public wasn't comfortable assuming that. The public wasn't that trustful of concentrated power in any form. So it really helped when the Bill of Rights got written back in. And that was essential. I think without that, maybe the Constitution wouldn't have had the support to get ratified or to have lasted as long as it did. So this is also very important. Fourth point to make about the Constitution, even once it got through, even with the Bill of Rights, there was a big question that those who studied it had. And it's a question that is still with us to this day. If we're willing to take the time to look critically at how the Constitution has actually fared over the last 250 years and how the country has fared with it. And by the way, it's a question we have to ask really again and again. It's a question we probably should ask continuously with any constitution. Citizens in any democratic country that is undergirded by a constitution should always be asking, will the system of government the Constitution is creating advance and protect basic human rights and democracy, of course, to facilitate the rule of law as well? Will it provide these essential goods? That's the point of the Constitution. Or are there any mechanisms in the Constitution that could obstruct them or could get in the way of them? And again, the US Constitution's record on this, in some ways, it's good, as I'll say in a moment. You can already see in item number 6, it did work overall, but not without difficulty. The preservation of slavery as an institution in the US was a compromise. It was a compromise that unfortunately could not be resolved peacefully. It led to the Civil War in the 1860s. There was a great deal of ambivalence about slavery to begin with. There were also some compromises about representation that were not necessarily resolved in a way that would best facilitate democracy in the years to come. Women were excluded from voting rights. Native Americans basically were not even mentioned in the Constitution. That's one problem that we can still try to work to remedy in the present day. So there's a lot of deficiencies, and this leads to item number 5. It wasn't the only deficiency in the Constitution, but if you look at American history, and this is a long story, and there are books written about this. One very good short book about it is called American Citizenship, The Quest for Inclusion by Judith Shklar, a late political theorist at Harvard. And the main point of that book is basically what I'm giving you in point number 5, so I probably should credit Professor Shklar for that. But ever since the Constitution came into existence, if you go back and look at American history, especially American history over citizenship, the entire history is marked. It's not necessarily dominated all the time, but it's very heavily marked throughout by struggles for inclusion. And also, I would add, full recognition and full respect. It's one thing to be formally included in a political system. And the end of slavery, of course, brought a series of amendments, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, which effectively ended slavery as an institution. It put in place a basis for equal citizenship of the country as well as the states. It also extended voting rights to African American men. That was I believe, the 15th Amendment, but it didn't take the step of including women at that point. And if you go back and study the movement in which women struggled to vote, look back at Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they were furious when these amendments came forward and women were still excluded. So their struggle would continue. And it was very sad because they had been fighting for abolition alongside Frederick Douglass since the 1840s and in all the middle years of the 1800s. And after the Civil War was over, instead of those sides, being in harmony with each other, they were very much split. Frederick Douglass at the time was arguing that as well, that women would have to wait. And it's interesting to go back and read his logic for that. And he had some very powerful things to say about race in the US at that time. So that's just one tiny example, very significant example, but one little example in 250 years of struggle. And that's something that continues to this day. Constitution has worked well, especially in the ways that it disperses power horizontally across the national government and then vertically in relation to states and localities. And I haven't even yet talked about the different branches of government that emerge from the Constitution. Today, we kind of take it for granted that most countries that are constitutional democracies have a mix of an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judiciary. That's for presidential systems anyway. Some parliamentary systems are a little bit different. But today we take that as kind of the gold standard. That's another one of my points. But anyway, this was innovative for the time. This was downright radical for the time to have no monarch. Again, the play Hamilton, where King George is amazed that George Washington first, that he goes back to his farm after the Revolutionary War, and then later he voluntarily steps down after 2 terms as president. So, not only did the Constitution set up ways in which power could be dispersed and shared, but the key people at the time were very sensitive to the idea that they didn't want to overstep the boundaries of power for the most part. So you had this series of compromises, and the way that the House was put together in Congress based on population, the way the Senate was put together based on states. So both the big states and the little states could get what they wanted. There was also a compromise, maybe more morally dubious, counting slaves as 3/5 of a person. That preserved a very uneasy balance with the northern and southern states. Again, if you were a betting person around 1787, the smart money at that point was still that the US would dissolve in fairly short order into a group of regional republics eventually, that the regions would band together, but the country wouldn't necessarily hold. Democracy, this is another important point to make. Democracy, and we can talk about it in terms of representative democracy, because that's really what was set up in the US. It was a system in which the citizens had some voice, but for the most part, the decisions were made not with the citizens directly participating, but with the representatives that the citizens would elect, and then the civil servants who would go on to run the bureaucracy. They would be the key people. Even the president was elected, as you well know, indirectly by the Electoral College, and state legislatures in the early days were the primary agents choosing the electors per state. So it was a very indirect form of democracy in its early days. But it was one that actually succeeded in holding the country together. And, we're still holding ourselves together close to 250 years later. So it's important to acknowledge that it worked well. One reason it worked well was that it wasn't just the institutions that it set up, but there was, alongside the US, remember, the US government, before the revolution, the 13 colonies had been the freest society on the face of the earth, with town meeting governments in many of the smaller communities, especially again in New England, but also in Virginia. You had elected legislatures in the states. You had states with their own constitutions. Even when they had royal charters, the states were very quick to come up with their own constitutions, especially going into the revolution. So you had a very strong civil society. You had people organizing themselves voluntarily. You had churches, you had community-run schools, you had systems in which people would help each other out in need. And all this was very, very important in nourishing and sustaining the legal and political systems that the US Congress created. There's an interesting book called Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. In many ways, he was the first comparative politics scholar, and maybe in some ways still the best comparative politics scholar we ever had. You can go and read his book from the 1830s. And he was very interested in looking at the US from France, which had had a revolution around the same time as the US. But France had reverted into a much more top down system. Think about Napoleon, who emerged not so long after the French Revolution. The spirit of the French Revolution did not last in a system of representative democracy, whereas in the US, a completely new place and a much larger territory, it did. So de Tocqueville visited the US in the early 1800s to try to figure out why, 1820s, 1830s. And he concluded that it was actually the civil society. It was all these voluntary associations that really nourished and sustained the public. So it's very important that this is something to remember for citizenship. Citizenship is not just what formal legal status we may have, it's also what Tocqueville labeled as habits of the heart. It's how people choose to think and live and situate themselves in political communities, really at all levels, even neighborhoods, which are not necessarily legally organized. Your neighborhood's your first basis of political involvement in many cases, or community involvement. And then that translates layer upon layer. This is also the beauty of federalism, right? You can think clearly about your town or your county or your state or the nation as a whole and think about different ways that you may be engaged within all of those different spheres. And it's important, and this is one concern I have about the state of the US, especially with our fragmented public sphere today, a lot of it driven by the fragmentation of media. One really important role for media in the present day is to help citizenry have a common basis for understanding the key issues of the day. And also, the citizenry in turn needs to be motivated and responsible to get organized and to take charge of the destiny of the country. If the citizenry weakens, the constitutional arrangements weaken as well. So we owe our success in many ways to the Constitution, to that and actively engaged citizenry. Point number 8, I already made throughout the 20th century, especially as the European empires that I mentioned earlier were basically giving way to independent countries, especially around World War II and its aftermath. And we had this massive, really explosion of new countries. There were 78 independent countries, independent sovereign countries in the year 1900. Now, the UN General Assembly, which is meeting this week in New York, there are 193 member countries of the UN General Assembly. Plus, you have the Vatican, you have the Palestinians, and you have Taiwan, which are not officially on the UN. So think about that the number of independent countries more than doubled, especially in the years after World War II. And as these countries themselves, in many cases, were trying to become democratic, many of them successfully, the US Constitution was what they used as their model again and again and again. So that is something that's very important. When we talk about global democracy, in many ways, the US system is the source of inspiration for that. But there are some hard questions we have to ask about democracy here in the US. And this is where I go with points 9 and 10. So, point number 9, and bear with me here because it'll take some explaining. Although the Constitution and the ways in which it distributed power, even though all that is a work of genius, the Constitution is also very difficult to amend. It is hard to update. It is hard because of the gridlock that all the dispersed political power creates. It's hard for policies in many cases to be made quickly, or it's hard for policies even to be made at all. It was almost a miracle that we came up with healthcare reform, partial healthcare reform at that, in the year 2010. It's not surprising in some ways that we've not been more aggressive on environmental policy over the years, especially when it comes to global warming, because it's hard to get consensus around that. So at times, and of course, the Electoral College, because of the way that it skews representation in presidential elections in favor of rural areas, whereas the population of the US, in fact, especially over the last 150 years, has become much more urban. The effect is that there are often political outcomes when it comes to national elections, presidential elections, and when it comes to votes in Congress, or even decisions by the Supreme Court in cases that actually contradict what the will would be of majorities at that point in time. So that is a problem. That can happen here and there, but if that becomes a recurring problem or issue upon issue, the Constitution is creating systems that contradict the will of majorities, then there's a need for some modification of the Constitution. So the point that I want to make is the Constitution was, in its time in 1787, remarkably innovative. But today, in some respects, it is dated. And we can argue, again, you may not agree, but there are significant changes that I think are needed to keep the US a kind of grown up democracy by today's standards. Now, before you all say that I just called the US something other than a grown up democracy, in other respects, it is a very grown up democracy. Point number 8 still stands. It is the prototype. The US system is the prototype. It's the gold standard and the role model for many democratic systems around the world. But we have learned a lot in the last 100 years about what works in democracies and what kinds of institutions and what kinds of elements of political power or electoral systems and so forth. Where is the state of the art with democracy today? There are various innovations, some of which I'll talk about in a minute, that may need to be added to the American system for the Constitution to be maximally effective going forward. So this leads me to point number 10, which, and again, not everybody would agree, but I'll make this point and you can debate it. I'm not really here to close any kind of debate. I'm here to open debate on this topic. So today we face the challenge, I think, of finding the right balance between tradition and innovation in the American political system. There's a lot in our tradition to celebrate. On the other hand, we should not rest on our laurels. If we do, if we become too complacent about the status quo, we will then fall behind. So how do we adjust the Constitution? There are all sorts of ideas for amendments, and I'm not going to necessarily endorse any one of these, but I wanted to give you a sense. If we're thinking, okay, what could we do to American political institutions to make the system more cutting edge today, where we would be in sync with the most up-to-date innovations that can produce the most effective political systems over a large scale? What would be some innovations we might think about, or some changes, some amendments? And here are some of them. One would be possible, and again, this all needs debating. Many of you might argue that we should have 2 presidential terms. In Korea, where I am sitting right now, where I work, we have a one-term presidency here in Korea that doesn't work so well here. In Korea, the argument is that we actually might need 2 terms in Korea instead of one. In the US, on the other hand, it might be better to have a longer presidential term. That, again, is something we can debate another time. It may be better to have term limits for members of Congress. There's recently been some talk about the Supreme Court and whether life terms are really the way to go. President Biden has proposed 18 years. We'll see where that goes. Congress is going to debate it, but it might be the kind of thing that would require a constitutional amendment. Pretty much all of what I'm listing here are items that would require amendments to the Constitution. I think maybe some of the most important areas are in this second category that I have here with regard to elections and representation. There's a lot to be said for systems of proportional representation that would better reflect the nuances of how people vote. So, for instance, if you support the Green Party, and again, not everybody does, but if you happen to support the Green Party and you know that almost no candidates from the Green Party are going to win a seat overall, but maybe 10 to 15% of Americans are going to support Green Party candidates, if you're very concerned about environmental issues, say, in a proportional representation voting system, there are some seats reserved for the minority parties that don't necessarily get a lot of seats. And then those minority parties can still have a presence in the Congress, in the national legislative. Should elections be run nationally now? When there's concern about irregularities from state to state or from city to city, is it necessary to have a more uniform system for managing elections? That's been another proposal that's been made, at least informally, for a constitutional amendment. Should campaigns all be publicly financed? Right now, there's a problem in which too much money from special interest groups goes to members of Congress when they're trying to get reelected, leaving questions sometimes as to whether members of Congress are representative of the citizens who elected them, or whether they're primarily representative of special interests. So would public financing be the way to go? That, again, would take a constitutional amendment, because right now, the reason that we have private financing allowed for presidential campaigns and congressional campaigns and so forth is because of the way we interpret the First Amendment, or at least the way the Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment for free speech. So again, a constitutional amendment might have to rejig the way we think about the way free speech plays out in the current political arena. So these are all some ways that we might think about changes to the Constitution. Finally, a couple of other ideas. Could the US Senate have its composition changed in a way that better reflects the urban versus rural divide in the US? That is not even necessarily fully reflected in the House, although the House does a better job reflecting it than the Senate. Do we need to abolish the filibuster that makes it possible for a minority, a significant minority of just over 40, but still a minority veto in the Senate? Is that something that would be worth thinking about? And what I would also argue we could consider, and I'll maybe leave you with this point and then go into some questions, could we possibly supplement the two branches of Congress with a citizens' assembly? Some of you might think, oh no, the last thing we need is more government. We have too much government as it is. But one thing that we've learned in political science over the last several decades is that there's room in all levels of government for more direct, not just input, but more direct decision making from everyday citizens. That it can be a very good thing when citizens come together in public forums and take the time to deliberate themselves, take the time, you're given the time really, to learn about the key issues at stake and deliberate with their peers and then connect with elected officials as well and engage their elected officials and have yet another voice. In the US of today, where we have what, 330 million people or so, I think there's room for a citizens assembly in which representation would be a little bit different than just ordinary elections. Members could be recruited almost in the same ways that public opinion polls are. When a public opinion poll is conducted, say you heard a poll in the presidential race, the way that works is polling companies get a random sample of the citizens. They get a small snapshot. They don't talk to large numbers of people. You can get a very reliable snapshot of the population just with a couple of thousand respondents to a poll. You could create a citizens' assembly that would be quite representative of the US in general through a lottery process, in a sense, what we call sortition in political science. And this could supplement the two branches of Congress and have some, at least some advisory capacities, and maybe even a more formal role if we were to come up with the right kinds of amendments to the Constitution. So these are some of the kinds of changes or innovations that could be made in American politics today. As I said earlier, it's very hard to get amendments passed in the first place. The Equal Rights Amendment, which many women's groups were fighting very hard to have passed, it nearly made it through a generation ago, but didn't quite get there. Political scientist Jane Mansbridge has a book called Why We Lost the ERA. If you're interested in a case study that would probably be meaningful for a lot of you, that really shows how hard it is to change the Constitution. Nevertheless, and whether or not we do change it, nevertheless, we should not take it for granted that further amendments are not needed. At the very least, these kinds of debates are healthy for our democracy. And by the way, last point, Thomas Jefferson, again, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson thought, and there's wording to this effect that's engraved at the Jefferson Memorial, if you ever go to Washington, D.C. Jefferson himself thought that every generation should rewrite the Constitution. I'm not sure I would go as far as Jefferson did. I wouldn't necessarily say that every 20 years or so. Jefferson actually said every 19 years. That was how he saw the lifespan of a generation or generational change. I'd say probably not every 19 years, but it's always good to be thinking through with our Constitution, what can we do to make it, that balance, to adjust that balance between tradition and innovation and think about how best to go forward in the years to come. So again, thank you all for taking the time to listen to me. Sorry about the glitch with the screen share earlier, and I'm more than happy to take your questions.
Okay, so I have a few questions. There is a lot of interest in South Korea, so and kind of that connection. So I'll start with Tori wants to know, did you find any specific difficulties adjusting to the different style of government in South Korea? If so, what were they?
Hi there, Tori. So South Korea has a presidential system. I do not have voting rights here because I'm not a full citizen. I'm also not even a permanent resident. One thing that's interesting here is that South Korea has a single legislative chamber. It's called the National Assembly. At least that's the English word for it. And what it means is that South Korea's system is easier to control from the presidential office. It used to be called the Blue House, but the president here, for reasons which I won't bore you with, the president recently moved out of Blue House. I will tell you actually, the president and his wife, I think is mainly his wife, the first lady, they thought the Blue House was cursed. They were superstitious. So because a lot of his predecessors have had bad luck. So we don't have the Blue House here anymore. We now have just the presidential office. It's just in an office tower now. It also houses the defense ministry, Korea's version of the Pentagon. It's actually an office tower. So the presidential office has moved, but you have the president and then you have a single chamber legislative branch. So it's actually much easier for the president to get his or her agenda through the assembly. And there was a her. We had a female president about a decade ago here, although she was impeached by the people. That's another complicated story. That one we really don't have time to discuss. So it's easier to get things done here in Korea. It reminds me a little bit of Britain, actually. I did my graduate work, as Professor Routen said, in the UK. So I've seen the British system as well, which is actually much more centralized, although these days the British want to have a much more decentralized set of institutions as well. So in the last 20 years, and it started under the Tony Blair government in Britain, there's now a parliament for Scotland. There's an assembly in Wales. There's also an assembly in Northern Ireland. There's a lot of talk about whether the English regions should be given some sort of a parliament or an assembly as well, although in many ways it's England that dominates at Westminster at the main parliament in London. By the way, the phrase grown-up democracy, I should have mentioned this to you earlier. My PhD supervisor in England, David Markland, used to talk about how he really wished for Britain to become a more grown-up democracy like the United States. That was his comparison. There was a famous book written in England years ago by Jonathan Freedland, a columnist for the Guardian newspaper there. It's called Bring Home the Revolution. So the British of today, some of the British, not all the British, there are many British that love the monarch as it is, but there are many British of today that actually are arguing that they would like to see a more federal Britain. Some of them wanted to see a federal Britain and a federal Europe. Brexit changed all that. So in some ways, the South Korean system with its single legislature is much more like the British system. If the president and the president's political party control the legislature, if the president's supporters are the dominant power in the legislature, everything goes through. Whereas in the US, the president has to have supporters in both houses of Congress to get anything done. The president, Joe Biden had support. President Biden had support in the House of Representatives in his first 2 years, but the Senate was deadlocked. That made things much more difficult. And that's a very common problem that American presidents face, is that one chamber of Congress might be with them, but the other chamber of Commerce less so. So it's easier to get things done over here. Another difference with Korean politics is that freedom of the press is not quite as absolute in Korea as it is in the U.S. Freedom of speech in the U.S. Is really very much a sacred right. There have been a whole series of court decisions over the years. You can watch the movie The Post about Katharine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post in the 1960s and 70s, when she got the Pentagon Papers, when her staff got the Pentagon Papers, and the government was taking the Post to court to try to stop them from publishing the details of that. It was all sorts of information about the war in Vietnam. And, it showed that, senior Defense Department officials knew the war was going much worse than they were actually telling the public at that time. The government tried to get the executive branch, I should say, tried to get the Post to hold off on publishing that, but the courts set the stage for publication. You had one branch of the government basically shutting down a gag order from another branch of the government. There are all sorts of other ways in which freedom of speech is very absolute here. So despite what I said a few minutes ago about campaign contributions, which I really think is a problem, and I think that probably should be an exception, that we should have public financing of campaigns, take the corporate money out of politics. There is something to be said about the strong tradition of free speech in the US, which we don't have in a lot of other places. So that's one answer for that. I could talk for another 10 minutes about that, but we better get some other questions in here.
Okay, so you may have already answered some of this, but this is from Stella. She says, "How has if it has, how has the U.S. Constitution influenced the development of South Korea's constitutional democracy? And like I said, I think you've answered some of this, but are there key differences that reflect South Korea's unique political and cultural context?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, Stella. Thank you. So, South Korea's first president, or is the country's official name, the Republic of Korea, the Republic of Korea's first president, Syngman Rhee, who had a very mixed track record. And I'm actually working on a paper on his life right now. But Rhee, who became the first president of South Korea in the late 1940s, at the time the Constitution was put in place, and he was very involved in the drafting of the Constitution. He had a doctorate in history from Princeton University in the US, which he had earned about a half century before that, around the time that all of Korea was taken over by Japan in the first decade of the last century. Syngman Rhee, who had been in jail, he had been in prison for several years under the old regime, basically in Korea. Back when Korea was its own country and had a monarch, a king, Rhee had been part of a group called the Independence Club, advocating at that point in time, not for a full scale American style democracy, but he had been advocating, and a lot of other people alongside him had been advocating for the king, at least to set up something akin to a governor's council, to begin to share a little bit of power with the people. Because the old monarch here, which lost power, a little over 100 years ago, that was really absolute power at the top. Unfortunately, that power goes, the centralized power domestically got so weak internationally that Japan ended up, and Russia actually ended up fighting over Korea 100 years ago and then taking over the country until Japan lost World War II. Russia lost the war to Japan, then Japan got the peninsula as kind of a spoil of war. So all that context is actually very important because once Korea ended up going over to Japan, he ended up going to the US. As I said, he got a doctorate at Princeton. As a young man, he actually met briefly with President Teddy Roosevelt, begging him basically not to sign a treaty, which they did at the time, brokering peace in the war between Russia and Japan, in which Russia was out, but Japan basically agreed that they would leave the U.S. alone in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War a few years earlier had led to that territory being part of the U.S. And the U.S. agreed in turn that the U.S. would let Japan have Korea. That was a kind of side agreement that accompanied the peace treaty that the U.S. was working out between Russia and Japan. That was all happening in Portsmouth, New Hampshire at that time. So Rhee went to the US and he spent the next several decades lobbying the US government to recognize a provisional government of Korean people that was actually scattered all over the place. Many of them were in China. Rhee and his supporters were in the US. There were some people even fighting within Korea itself at this point in time. But Rhee's argument, and he ended up being the most influential person after Japan lost World War II, and Korea at that point was divided by the US and the Soviet Union, and South Korea was under the US military at that point, which then had the challenge of helping the civilians come up with a government of their own. Um, Rhee was very enthusiastic about coming up with a political system that was as close to the US Constitution as they possibly could. So that's why this country doesn't have a parliamentary system. That would have been another option. Japan, by the way, has a parliamentary system, fairly similar to the British system. The Koreans did not want to go that particular route. There was a much stronger link between many of the independence fighters from Korea toward the US political system and toward the US generally. Even today, at my university, runs more like an American university than like a British university for reasons that are very similar. So there's actually a lot of American political culture here. Not only that, we have McDonald's and Burger King and Dunkin' Donuts and Baskin Robbins and especially Starbucks at just about every corner. So now some of that is American corporate globalization rather than American constitutionalism. But there is some of it. And by the way, the bit I mentioned about the country's first female president being impeached, her father, her name was Park Geun-hye, her father, Park Chung-hee, had been the military ruler of Korea for a couple of decades in the 60s and 70s going back. Then his daughter became the president. But one thing I want to mention is when she was impeached, the Constitutional Court upheld the impeachment and she was removed from office, something that's never happened in the US after impeachments. We've had presidents impeached in the US, but never removed from office. In Korea, we actually had a president that left. So in that sense, and that the impeachment process was brought to its full completion, so to speak, in that way you could say, well, Korea carried the US Constitution even further than the Americans have. So that is also very interesting. It was the whole episode would have been nice if there had never been that scandal in the first place that led the president to be impeached. But nevertheless, the rule of law prevailed here. And again, that was following the footsteps of the American tradition. That's important to mention in itself.
Okay. This question is from Mallory. She says, in your bio, it speaks of how you teach not only about South Korean government, but also governments throughout Europe, East Asia, and the United States. In your studies of the different governments, do you see any repeating factors that span across all of them?
Well, in many cases, rule of law, but it's rule of law that goes in many different directions. I tend to study the democracies, by the way. In East Asia, we have many countries that are non-democracies. I've not studied them. I mainly study South Korea. I've studied North Korea a little bit, so that's an interesting contrast, of course. I've studied Japan. I'd say that one thing I want to say, and I'll actually be very brief about it. In all of these places, and by the way, in many of the societies in this part of the world in Asia where we don't really have full democracies, what I see actually is a tremendous amount of support for universal human rights, even in countries where the governments in question might not be that adept at fulfilling human rights. There was some debate years ago between two prominent leaders here in East Asia, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, and for that matter, Kim Dae-jung in South Korea. And Lee Kuan Yew was arguing, and again, Singapore is a more authoritarian country than South Korea. South Korea, Taiwan, and followed by Japan. These are the more democratic societies in East Asia. Singapore less so, even though it has some makings of constitutional democratic institutions. But Singapore's got much more of a pendulum shift in favor of some very centralized state control in ways that can impinge on civil liberties. Lee Kuan Yew argued that human rights should be downgraded as a kind of Western construct and that Asian values don't necessarily buy into human rights. Asian values may emphasize, community and family obligation and even nationalism much more so than basic individual rights. But I think even if those elements or those values, even if those values are important to many people around the world, and they're important, of course, not just to people in East Asia, they're important to people worldwide. I see a dual emphasis. I think people cherish, certain Asian values over here, but I see a tremendous amount of support for universal human rights. And to the point where we could argue that even if the philosophy of human rights originates in the West, that there is actually something much more universally appealing about it today that's actually very powerful. So that's one commonality that I might highlight.
Okay. This one is from Nicole. It says, in light of your research on citizenship and democracy, how do you see the relationship between national identity and global citizenship evolving in the coming years, particularly in politically diverse regions?
That's a fascinating question, Nicole. Thank you. And there's a lot of controversy, I suppose, in the political arena about whether there is any such thing as a global citizen. Shortly after former President Trump was elected in 2016, he argued at a rally in Ohio. He was thanking the state of Ohio for voting for him, and he argued at that rally that there was no such thing as global citizenship. And interestingly enough, Theresa May, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, which had just voted a few months later to leave the European Union, she too, around the same time, had argued there was no such thing as a global citizenry. But I think one thing that's often misunderstood about global citizenry, and again, there's all different ways of understanding it, but many people, when they hear global citizenry, they assume that that means some sort of centralization of power that would downgrade the nation state or even put nation states out of business. But if we think about global citizenship, and again, I talked about citizenship earlier in the context of the US, that it's not just what country you're legally part of. One element of citizenship might be the legalistic formal membership, the passport bit, in which you have a passport of one country or another, or you're a permanent resident, if not a full citizen of one country, but not another. Yet citizenship is also, again, back to Alexis de Tocqueville, it's how individuals choose to interact and how people choose to participate or how people choose to see themselves as having responsibilities or even moral obligations within larger communities. If you're concerned about the environment today, or if you're concerned about the well-being of women, not just in your home country, but women all around the world, or you're concerned about the, again, human rights, say the human rights of workers around the world, or the human rights of children around, say you're concerned about children that are forced to work rather than going to school. There's lots of issues that really cut across international borders. Or if you're thinking about the clothing you're wearing or the computer that you just bought that was made in some faraway place, and you're thinking, what were the working conditions, that person went through to make that product that you now have that got to you. That's not formally global citizenship by any stretch of the imagination, but when you think along those lines, or if you see a natural disaster that happens in some other country and you want to be responsive to it, and again, new technology, communication platforms leave us feeling much more connected to people around the world. Take COVID-19, as we look at the death toll of COVID around the world, what could be done to kind of alleviate that sort of suffering globally. Um, Anytime you're thinking of yourself as in a community of people, or if you're in a religious group, if you're in a particular church and you know your church has members outside the borders of the country, how do you think of yourself as connected to people beyond the borders of your immediate country? That's a way of that I would argue fits into an actively engaged version of citizenship that does not have to be confined to any particular space. We can even talk about intergenerational citizenship, thinking about the rights that future generations may have to live well and what kinds of duties that would impose on those of us living here in the present day. What kind of, you'll think about this more as you get older, but what kind of world do you want to leave behind to your children or your grandchildren as well? And not just your individual children or grandchildren, but the entire assemblage of humanity that will follow us. So there are ways of thinking more expansively across space and time. And yes, on the one hand, the nation state isn't going away. Whenever you watch a World Cup soccer match or the Olympics this summer, as we did, you can see very strongly how powerful the nation really is. It's especially powerful here in Korea, by the way. Korean nationalism is extremely strong because the Koreans lost their country 100 years ago. So they know what it's like to lose a country. And today, Korean, in many ways, Korean national identity of today grew out of the resistance to Japan taking over the peninsula 100 years ago. Um, and Koreans are also very proud. When aside about the Olympics, when the Republic of Korea's team was announced at the Olympics in Paris this summer, it was some sort of a technical glitch where they were actually announced as the Democratic Republic of Korea. But that's the name for North Korea. They were announced as North Korea, not South Korea. And people here were furious. So, and they're still arguing with France about that, by the way. That created a diplomatic incident. And there's an angry article about the whole thing in the campus newspaper this month at Yonsei as we've come back to school here. So, yes, nationalism is very, very strong and very powerful, but it's not the only way of thinking about citizenship. You can simultaneously think of yourself as a very patriotic American or a patriotic citizen of South Carolina, however you would think of yourself in that respect, or your town or Greenville, whatever have you. But you can also think of yourself as interconnected with the world as a whole, whether or not you use the idea of global citizen, whether or not that term is how you go about it, or if you just think of yourself as a good human being or a concerned human being. There's all different ways of thinking about it, but the ways that we talk about belonging and obligation and loyalty and membership, can be very cross-cutting in this sense.
Okay. It's I think it's probably around midnight at your where you are. So I
I can
don't
take another one though.
Okay. So I have a little bit of a complex one. So I'm actually going to send this to you by chat, but I'm going to read it as well. But
Mm-hmm.
like me, sometimes I need to see things. So oh sorry, that's the wrong one. I apologize. Give me 1 second.
Okay, we've got that one already.
Yes, that's the
We
one
have
I
a question about South Korea, so I'll tell you. I think we've talked enough about them.
This one is
So let's.
about so I'm trying to hold on 1 second. I apologize, trying to copy and paste here because
No
it's in
worries.
the chat. Oh, it's still not coming up for some reason. It's not allowing me to
You can just
copy.
go ahead and read it if you like,
Okay.
Professor Round.
So this is from actually Dr. Sasser, who's our philosophy professor. So it seems like you're broadly advocating for a more direct democracy. Madison and Hamilton were afraid of direct democracy because they thought it would lead to bad outcomes for society. Your argument seems to be that republicanism, more indirect democracy, is leading to worse outcomes for society, some of which you've listed. But this in turn seems to hinge on your particular notion of what's good for society. Is it then the case that disagreements about the Constitution might hinge on a fundamental difference about the definition of what's good?
Well, that's a great question. That's something to debate at a future constitutional convention, I guess, if we ever have one. One thought, thank you very much for that question. One thought I have though, and again, I've often said to my classes, I would love it if we could bring the framers back somehow. If we could revive them and bring them back in the year 2024, wouldn't they be stunned at where the U.S. has gone? And even the framers themselves had very different perspectives on what was good, by the way. Again, the difference that, say, Alexander Hamilton had and Thomas Jefferson had going forward was very interesting after the Constitution was ratified. As some of you who've studied American politics might well know, Hamilton advocated building up national institutions, creating a national bank, basically strengthening the hand of this new federal government, again, to put the solid system in place that had been the whole point of the Constitutional Convention to begin with. But Thomas Jefferson and his followers, in many respects, were, and I don't want to I'm oversimplifying the dividing line in some respects. In some ways, they converge. But Jefferson, it wanted to advantage small farmers, have the more rural, immediate way of life, have more direct democracy in many respects at lower levels. He championed that. Was his version of republicanism. You can have, this is an interesting thing when we talk about a republic, meaning ruled by the people, whether direct or indirect. There are all different ways that that can emerge at different kinds of levels. And at a small, immediate local level, yes, direct democracy might very well seem more feasible. The framers didn't think anything approaching direct democracy was feasible at the national level. But a couple of things have changed, big things anyway, big picture things. One is that we have much greater technology. It's easier now for Americans to find out in real time what's happening in the Congress, what the big issues are. There's been talk in the last 30 years, should we have more online voting? Specific items go through the legislature. There's ways to argue against that. You could say, wait a minute, we ordinary citizens, we like our private lives. We don't want to have the responsibility of figuring out, what we should be deciding at the national level. That's why we put representatives. That's why we elect representatives in the first place. We don't want direct democracy. And in many respects, that may still be the way to go. But now that we have public opinion polling, pretty sophisticated public opinion polling, there's also the danger, this is a separate issue, that representatives will govern based on the latest public opinion poll and not necessarily get out in front and lead the country in the first place as well. So the relationship that citizens have with the government has changed. We're all, like it or not, we all have much more proximity to information now. We have proximity to the decisions that are coming out of the government, but we don't necessarily have the direct voices that go into the government. So this is my argument that we can have something of a citizens assembly. And by the way, if we had a citizens assembly, I think it would still be a representative group. If we were to take that to its full conclusion, I don't envision something like online voting where any citizen in any given day would be able to tune in and vote whenever they saw fit. But I would see another institutional access point to the larger system in which you would have citizens put there basically based on lottery, maybe 2-year terms. If you'd get a leave of absence, say if I were to win the lottery and be on the citizens assembly, I'd take a leave of absence from my job here, and I wouldn't necessarily get it. Any one of you, anyone at all, could get the job. Some people would take it, some people wouldn't take it. If you ran a small business, you probably couldn't take it because you couldn't be away from your business for that length of time. But you would try to get a representative group of people that would mirror the characteristics of the citizenry in general. One thing that we have seen increasingly is people that run for office, probably because it costs so much, they tend to be skewed. The people that are serving in Congress, and I guess this was always the case, and there's, again, the framers made arguments that we should have better educated and higher class people as the representatives in Congress. But there's an argument to be made, especially in this day and age, that we could have a composition of an assembly, a national assembly, that would be more reflective, that would look more like the country as a whole, and that representative body, even as people immerse themselves for 2 years, say, in their job as citizen legislators, citizens really holding this temporary office, that would bring a whole different set of perspectives into public debate, I think. So in many ways, a deliberative assembly, like I'm describing, is still a representative institution. It's not entirely direct, but it's representative on a different basis and in a way that it might have a little bit more proximity with segments of the population, of all kinds, that might be a little further away from the channels of power right now. So that just maybe scratches the surface of the question, but I hope it's at least a partially satisfying answer.
Okay. Did you want to take another one, or I know, like, I don't want to keep too much of your time.
Yeah,
So
maybe one more. I don't turn to a pumpkin at midnight or a pumpkin coach or whatever, but
well, it's
anyway,
funny because you're in the next day now. You're ahead of us,
I
so
am.
you're in the
It's
future.
it's now September 17th there. Yep.
Yes. So, let's see. I'm going through what I have here. I'll go with this first one. So this one, I think you've spoken somewhat to this, but I'll give this more direct question. So this is from Micah. And Micah says, thank you first for taking the time to speak with us. And so we often take our liberties here in the U.S. for granted. Our freedom of assembly and speech could be considered the most commonly utilized protection here in America. Through the U.S. and though the U.S. and South Korea have similar types of governments, with current events and the rise of political strains in both countries, do you find yourself ever feeling the need to censor yourself more strictly when teaching in South Korea or America for the purpose of self-preservation?
No, I never censor myself, actually. Not with all of you, not with my students here. No, and I try to encourage my students not to censor themselves either. It's a very good question, by the way. And I can understand why you would ask that question. So thank you for that. Because there are occasionally tensions in the U.S. Korea alliance. And again, I mean, many Koreans actually are unhappy, I suppose. I mean, Koreans have a range of perspectives on the U.S. I mean, many Koreans thank the U.S. for being here. I mean, we have American troops that are still here, and today they're in many ways defending and deterring North Korea from potentially attacking the country without the American presence here. I mean, I would worry about what would happen to the peninsula, to the southern half of it anyway, if the American troops weren't here. So I think Koreans are very grateful to the American government and the American people that they came here during the war in 1950. But on the other hand, when you look further in history, and Koreans that look deeper into the history, and they see, as I said earlier, that the U.S. actually, in many ways, helped create some of the conditions that led Japan to take over, and then divided the peninsula with the Soviet Union at the time after World War II. That was not how Koreans were hoping things would resolve with Japan, with the country getting divided. And then, of course, and then occasionally there's differences of opinion. When President Trump was in office, he was arguing with the South Korean government, similar to the ways that President Trump was arguing that NATO member states should pay more money. He was arguing that South Korea should pay more money to the U.S. But South Korea all along has already been paying a tremendous amount of money to the U.S. And it also gives a lot of land to the U.S. to have military bases here. And it's also strategically useful for the U.S., even important for the U.S. to have a military presence here in this part of the world, especially given Korea's China. So at the end of the day, I think even though President Trump was talking during his term about possibly pulling U.S. troops out, and by the way, former President Jimmy Carter was exploring the same kind of thing when he was in office in the 1970s. There are a lot of reasons why that kind of thing doesn't happen. So yes, there are times when the details of the relationship or even the broader history of the relationship between the US and South Korea can be quite tricky. Um, I just always try to speak freely, but I try to look at every single side in the case. I try to see things both from the Korean side's point of view and the US side's point of view. And I think in many respects, and today, of course, the US and South Korea are very close allies. And both countries right now, especially, are positioning themselves as constitutional democracies in a world where it's important for constitutional democracies to stand together. In fact, South Korea over the last few years has been hosting the Summit for Democracy alongside the US. The US has had a series of partner countries working on that, and Korea has been one of those countries. So that's also worth noting. Anyway, hope some of that is helpful.
Okay. Well, I think I'll bring it to a close because it's about 11, almost 11:15 here. And I just want to tell you how much we have appreciated you joining us today and how much we have enjoyed learning from you. And I'd like to ask, if you don't mind, if you would, had a few people ask if you would send your list of points. They would like to see them fully and have a copy of them. Um,
Sure.
but thank you again. I want to thank everyone who attended today and took the time out of your busy schedule.